For nearly half a minute after beheading, a human head may still be aware. The eyes can blink. The lips might try to shape a final word. And in those brief, terrible seconds, consciousness hangs on while everything else is slipping away. If that's true, then Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, may have lived through a few haunting heartbeats after the sword fell. It's a detail most histories tiptoe around, but once you stop looking away, you realize something even darker than the cut itself. Anne's execution wasn't just a death. It was the final note in a long, deliberate symphony of psychological torment. In Tudor England, killing someone was rarely the whole punishment. Death was the end point, sure, but the real sentence was humiliation. Public, scripted, staged like theater. A warning to everyone watching. And Anne wasn't executed simply because the king thought she'd betrayed him. Her last days were designed to dismantle her, to grind her down piece by piece, until the blade was almost a formality. What happened in May of 1536 wasn't a tragic accident of politics. It was Henry VIII deciding to erase a woman who had become inconvenient. By May 19th, Anne had already spent 17 days locked in the Tower of London. Think about the cruelty in that alone. This was the same fortress that had once held her in gleaming anticipation, only 3 years earlier, when she waited to be crowned Queen of England. She had walked those corridors on the way to glory. Now she was trapped in them, listening to her own world collapse. Henry didn't rush her to the scaffold. He stretched the time out. He postponed the execution again and again, letting uncertainty do its work. In Tudor prisons, delay was a weapon. Prisoners often said the waiting hurt more than dying, the sick dread of waking every morning wondering if today was the day. Henry knew that, and he used it. Even what later got framed as mercy was part of the cruelty. Instead of the traditional English axe, Henry summoned a French swordsman. On paper, the sword was cleaner, quicker, more professional. But in reality, it added another layer of spectacle. It turned Anne's death into an event, a performance with special casting. A foreign executioner brought in at great cost, so everyone would talk about it, so the story would spread. And Anne, somehow, kept her composure. Witnesses said she seemed almost cheerful, smiling, joking, even flirting with the edge of gallows humor. At one point she quipped that she had a little neck, as if trying to make light of what was coming. Today we might recognize that demeanor for what it often is: dissociation. The mind snapping into a strange calm because the reality is too big, too brutal, too impossible to hold directly. It's not peace, it's survival. Because beneath that surface, Anne knew exactly what had been done to her. The accusations were monstrous: adultery, incest, conspiracy to murder the king. Stories so outrageous that in any honest court, they would have collapsed into laughter. But Henry's court wasn't honest. It was controlled. The rumors became propaganda, repeated until they sounded like truth. The aim wasn't just to kill Anne. It was to destroy her reputation so thoroughly that her death looked deserved. And there was a bigger target too: her daughter, Elizabeth. If Anne was branded a traitor and a whore in the public mind, then Elizabeth could be stripped of legitimacy. Anne understood that her execution wasn't only about her body. It was about making England forget that she had ever been a rightful queen, and making her child seem like a mistake that never should have existed. The morning of May 19th broke bright over London. Clear sky, warm light, a cruel contrast to what waited on the other side of her window. Anne had barely slept that night. Records say she asked for the sacrament around 2 in the morning, then knelt in prayer for hours. By dawn, she'd been awake nearly a full day, exhausted, terrified, and yet oddly animated when they finally came to her chamber. People wrote that she laughed with her ladies-in-waiting, that she seemed light, almost giddy. But that kind of laughter doesn't always mean courage. Sometimes it's what happens when stress goes beyond what a human mind can calmly process. When your body is shaking and your brain is searching for any way, any crack of air, to stay upright. The delays had already done their work. She had been told one day, then another, then another. Each time she was forced to rehearse her own death in her imagination. Each time the countdown reset. It was psychological torture by design. When the moment finally came, she was escorted out of her chambers and down hallways she'd once walked as queen. But now there were no bows, no courtiers lowering their eyes in reverence, only guards, close, watchful, not there to protect her, but to make sure she didn't escape or speak to anyone who might still love her. The people who once swore loyalty watched from a safe distance, eager to prove they had nothing to do with her disgrace. At Tower Green, the scaffold waited. Not the high dramatic platform you see in movies, but a low construction, barely 3 feet off the ground. That detail matters because it forced her closer to the crowd, closer to the faces, closer to the whispers and jeers. The point wasn't to let her die above everyone else. The point was to drag her down into them. Executions in Tudor England were carnivals, not solemn, not quiet. The crowd wasn't there to mourn. It was there to consume. Supporters of the king were often planted among the spectators to cheer, to shout insults, to make sure the mood felt like justice, not tragedy. Anne would have heard it all as she stepped forward. Witch, adulteress, traitor. The humiliation was part of the sentence. Before she knelt, tradition allowed her to speak, but even that privilege was a trap. Her final words had to be cautious, polished, safe. She couldn't lash out. She couldn't swear her innocence too loudly. Any hint of rebellion could be turned against Elizabeth, could be used to justify worse cruelty. So she chose a careful script. "Good people," she said, "I am come hither to die according to the law, and thus yield myself to its judgment." On the surface, it sounded obedient, submissive. But there was something sharper hidden underneath. She did not confess. She did not say she deserved it. She acknowledged the law without admitting guilt, an elegant, quiet refusal to validate the lies that had brought her here. And the king? He wasn't even there. Henry VIII stayed at Whitehall Palace, waiting for the confirmation, like someone waiting for paperwork to clear. He didn't come to watch her die, not out of mercy, out of indifference. His mind was already on Jane Seymour, the woman he planned to marry as soon as Anne was gone. For Henry, Anne's death wasn't heartbreak, it was logistics. Then the French swordsman stepped forward. The sword was meant to be swift and precise. No hacking, no repeated blows the way an English axe sometimes required. And yes, by Tudor standards, that was merciful. But it also meant Anne died by the hand of a stranger, a man who had never served her court or country. Even in her final breath, she was stripped of familiarity. They tied the blindfold, not just to spare her fear, but to keep her still. She didn't rest her head on a block. French custom had her kneel upright, holding her posture while the executioner positioned himself behind her. Imagine that. Blindfolded, knees on the wood, back straight, trying not to flinch while listening for the faint shift of feet, the whisper of steel. Witnesses said her lips moved in prayer, that her eyes flickered under the cloth. Those final seconds of waiting, when you know death is coming, but not the instant it arrives, are a torture all their own. When the sword fell, it was clean. One stroke. A single sharp line between life and silence. But even then, the horror didn't end right away. Some onlookers swore her eyes blinked, that her mouth twitched, as though her prayer had been cut mid-sentence, and her body didn't yet understand it was over. People fainted. Others turned their faces away, and still the ritual continued. There was no coffin waiting for her, no dignified preparation. Her ladies, shaking and sobbing, had to scramble for an old wooden chest to hold what was left of their queen. Anne Boleyn, the woman crowned at Westminster Abbey with all the pageantry of England, was lowered into a crude box like an afterthought. She was buried quickly in the Tower Chapel, without ceremony, without a proper Christian funeral, in an unmarked grave among other executed nobles. Even in death, she was denied softness, denied honor, denied memory. And that was the point, because Henry's cruelty wasn't finished when the sword stopped moving. The true violence had always been larger than the scaffold. What happened there was only the opening act of an even colder plan, to wipe Anne Boleyn from history itself. The cruelty of Anne Boleyn's execution didn't end with the fall of the sword. Its shadow stretched outward into the lives of everyone who had stood close enough to be splashed by her downfall. In Tudor court politics, a queen didn't die alone. Her death rippled through households, through reputations, through childhoods. And if Henry's goal was to erase Anne completely, then the suffering of those around her wasn't collateral damage. It was part of the design. Start with the women who served her. These were not distant observers. These were ladies who had brushed her hair, laced her gowns, sat beside her at feasts, and listened to her fears when the palace lights went out. On the morning of May 19th, they watched their queen walk out to the scaffold. And after the crowd drifted away, after the cheers and gasps dissolved into ordinary London noise, those women were left with the reality no one else had to face. They had to clean what was left of her. They had to gather her decapitated body, prepare her head for burial, and do it all in silence, knowing that a single wrong look could make them the next targets. Imagine that kind of horror, holding the broken remains of the woman you loved, while soldiers watch your hands and your face for any sign of grief that might be confused with loyalty. Accounts suggest some of those women never truly recovered. The tower wasn't just a place of death, it was a place of memory that clung to you. Nightmares followed them. Court life, once glittering, would have felt poisonous after that morning. At least one of her attendants eventually left the world of court altogether, seeking refuge in a convent. Not because she was devout in some sudden awakening, but because the air of Henry's palace had become unbreathable. When you're forced to witness something like that, normal life doesn't snap back into place. You don't return to banquets and laughter unchanged. And the psychological shock didn't stop with Anne's household. The entire court absorbed the message. If a crowned queen could be humiliated, defamed, decapitated, and dumped into an unmarked grave, then what chance did anyone else have? Power at Henry's court wasn't stability. It was a trap door. The floor could open beneath you at any moment. So fear became the true ruler in those halls. Fear so thick it trained people to silence themselves before words even formed. Courtiers learned to avoid certain names, certain topics, certain facial expressions. Survival meant invisibility. To be noticed too much was to be endangered. And then there was Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, still a toddler in a nursery, still learning how the world worked. She didn't understand politics. She didn't understand what treason was. She barely knew what death meant. But within hours of Anne's execution, Elizabeth's life was stripped down like a room emptied after a burglary. She was declared illegitimate, removed from the line of succession, her household dismantled, her attendants dismissed. Court documents even suggest that she was left without proper clothing, her needs ignored, her status reduced to a kind of living embarrassment. That cruelty against a child tells you something brutal about Henry's purpose. It wasn't enough to kill Anne. He had to poison the future she represented. Because Elizabeth was Anne's defiance made flesh. And if Henry could crush the child, then Anne's memory could be bent until it broke. Modern retellings often smooth these edges. We get a noble queen, a hushed crowd, a quick and clean ending. But the real Tower Green wasn't a movie set. It stank of previous deaths. The scaffold had likely been used before, and blood doesn't wash out of wood easily. May heat would have brought flies. The air would have been thick and restless, and the crowd wasn't silent. Far from it. Supporters of the king were planted deliberately, like actors in a play. Their job was to cheer, to jeer, to keep the mood from turning sympathetic. Anne walked toward her death hearing insults that were meant to follow her into history. Witch, whore, traitor. The execution wasn't designed to be solemn. It was designed to be loud. Humiliation was the true instrument. Even Anne's final speech, often romanticized as noble defiance, was more complicated. She didn't stand there with freedom. She stood there under surveillance, knowing her words might determine how harshly the crown treated her daughter afterward. So she praised Henry as a merciful king, not because she believed those words, because she understood the game even at the edge of death. Her speech was not self-expression. It was a hostage note. A queen forced to perform obedience so her child might one day breathe easier. That's what it means to be silenced even while speaking. The French sword itself was part of the theater. Henry spared no expense in bringing in an executioner renowned specifically for his exquisite skill. They said he practiced on animals to perfect the single clean stroke. Think about that. Weeks of effort, money, planning, not to save Anne, but to ensure her death went exactly as Henry wanted it to go. No messy struggle, no botched blow, no delay that might humanize her. This was a production. The sword was a prop in a larger message. The king was powerful enough to choreograph even the manner of your dying. And in truth, no English executioner was trained for the French method. The weapon was different. The stance was different. The cut was horizontal, swift, clean, completely unlike the brutal downward chop of an English axe. Henry didn't choose the sword out of kindness. He chose it because it controlled the narrative. A clean stroke looks merciful. A clean stroke feels like authority, like inevitability. After the cut, the ritual demanded spectacle. The executioner lifted the head by the hair, holding it high so the crowd could see. Blood still ran. A grotesque punctuation mark on the king's story. People gasped, some wept, others shouted approval. In that moment, Anne was transformed from a human being into a warning sign. Thomas Wyatt was imprisoned in the Tower at the time. He had known Anne. Some say he admired her. Some say he loved her. Whatever the truth, he watched her death from behind stone and iron. Later, he wrote about the little neck that had once gleamed with jewels, now severed and displayed like a trophy. His words weren't just grief. They were horror at the speed of the transformation. A woman who had been the sun of court life, reduced to an object held aloft for public consumption. Afterward, her body was wrapped in linen by trembling attendants and forced into that crude wooden chest, likely one that had once stored arrows. No procession, no tolling bells for mourning, no proper funeral rites. She was buried quickly beneath the chapel floor, among other executed nobles, her grave left unmarked. That disgrace wasn't accidental. It was policy. Henry wanted Anne to vanish, not just from his life, but from England's memory. So he moved to erase her in every way a king could. Portraits were ordered destroyed. Initials carved into palaces were chiseled away. Those who had once spoken her name with admiration now learned to swallow it before it reached their lips. The violence done to Anne was historical as much as physical. She was rewritten while still warm in the ground. In the years that followed, Henry's propagandists worked hard to paint her execution as merciful. The expert swordsman wasn't described as an expensive showpiece, but as evidence of the king's reluctant kindness. The grotesque reality of those final seconds was replaced in official versions with a dignified passing. Repetition does powerful things. It can fossilize a lie into something that feels like truth. And that official narrative shaped Anne's image for centuries, covering the brutality with a thin layer of ceremony. Maybe the most unsettling detail of all is how Henry behaved after. Just one day after Anne's execution, he was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. There was no pause, no visible grief. Within 2 weeks, they were married quietly at Whitehall Palace. The speed is breathtaking. Even by the standards of royal politics, it's cold. For Henry, Anne's death wasn't tragedy. It was a solution. She had failed to give him a living male heir. She had challenged his control. She had become, in his eyes, a political problem. So she was removed and replaced almost immediately by a woman he hoped would succeed where Anne had not. The court followed his lead. Life resumed with disturbing ease. Banquets restarted. Music returned. People who had watched a queen die days earlier smiled over wine as if a storm had passed, and the air was fresh again. That's what absolute power does to a society. It teaches people to adapt to horror like it's weather. Anne Boleyn's execution was not simply about ending a life. It was about control, over bodies, over stories, over memory. She wasn't just punished. She was dismantled, transformed into a public lesson, and then scrubbed from the walls of the kingdom. But Henry still wasn't finished breaking her before she died. In the weeks leading up to Tower Green, Anne endured methods we'd recognize today as psychological torture. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and architect of the charges, ensured she was isolated from allies, interrogated relentlessly, deprived of sleep, fed misinformation that twisted her sense of reality. The goal wasn't just a conviction, it was disorientation, confusion, collapse. By the time she stepped onto the scaffold, her resistance had been picked apart in private. The execution only made it public. And so the spectacle of Anne's death didn't just end one woman. It reshaped everyone who witnessed it. It warned every courtier. It scarred every servant. It punished a child. It tried to poison history itself. And for a while, it worked. Anne was not alone in her downfall. In the days leading up to her execution, 5 men were put to death for supposedly sleeping with the Queen. One of them her brother, George Boleyn. Their executions were not separate tragedies. They were the prelude, a carefully staged opening act designed to make Anne's guilt seem undeniable before she ever stepped onto the scaffold. It's a tactic that shows up again and again in regimes that want obedience more than truth. Execute the accomplices first. Kill the supporting cast so the main character stands alone. Once those men were dead, there was no one left to contradict the story. No one left to testify in her favor. No living witness who could say, "This isn't real." And the evidence against them, against her, was paper thin. Even some contemporaries thought the accusations were absurd. The dates didn't fit. The locations didn't fit. The alleged affairs overlapped in ways that made them physically impossible. But that didn't matter. Henry's government controlled the court, and with control of the court came control of reality. By the time Anne was called to Tower Green, England had already been trained to see her as guilty. It's easy, 500 years later, to imagine her execution as a tragic but straightforward event. A queen falls out of favor. A trial happens. A sword swings. But what unfolded in 1536 was closer to a show trial than a search for justice. Cromwell didn't build a case to discover the truth. He built a case to serve a decision already made. And once you understand that, everything about those final weeks reads differently. Look at the security surrounding her execution. The tower's garrison was doubled. Extra guards were posted along the grounds and in the halls. Not because Anne was likely to escape. She had nowhere to go. Not because she might be rescued. No one in England was crazy enough to attempt it. The force was there for symbolism, to intimidate, to remind every watcher that the crown was watching back. Even the timing was chosen for maximum effect. Rather than at dawn, when fewer people could attend, her execution was staged mid-morning. Nobles gathered on Tower Green. Ordinary Londoners pressed close enough to catch glimpses, then carried the story into the city like wildfire. When the sword finally fell, church bells rang across London, announcing her death like a victory anthem. What should have been a private tragedy was turned into a national performance. And performances are about the audience. The king's audience wasn't just the crowd on the grass that day. It was every ambitious courtier, every noblewoman, every foreign ambassador taking notes, every future rival who might one day imagine standing too tall. Anne's death wasn't merely punishment. It was policy. A lesson written in blood. Rise too far, and you can be unmade. Centuries later, the record itself reflects how thoroughly the story was engineered. We don't even agree on every physical detail. Some accounts conflict over where exactly the scaffold stood. Some memorials mark one spot on Tower Green. Others hint it may have been placed differently. That uncertainty isn't just a quirk of history. It mirrors the larger distortion wrapped around Anne's life. Her story was shifted, reshaped, romanticized and scrubbed until even the ground beneath her death feels unsettled. That's what happens when power controls narrative. Truth becomes something malleable. Memory becomes something political. The sanitized version of Anne Boleyn, the graceful queen meeting her fate with quiet dignity, sits uneasily beside the reality. The reality was manipulation, defamation, intimidation, isolation, propaganda, delay. It was a campaign. A slow execution carried out long before the blade arrived. From a psychological perspective, Anne's ordeal reads like state-sponsored gaslighting. She was accused of crimes so outrageous they strain belief. Incest, adultery with multiple men, plotting to poison the king. The sheer scale of the accusations was part of the strategy. If you throw enough mud, something will stick. If you repeat the claims enough times, the public stops asking whether they're plausible and starts asking whether they're true. And when every court preacher, Every royal proclamation, every whisper in the marketplace depends on those claims being true. People fall in line, not because they're convinced, but because believing the official story is safer than questioning it. That manipulation of reality may have been the cruelest cut of all. Anne wasn't just killed. She was made into a villain before she died. Her reputation was destroyed so completely that her death could be celebrated. Henry wanted her to become a cautionary tale, not a woman. For a while, he nearly succeeded. In the years after her execution, Anne's memory was treated like contraband. Courtiers who had once adored her avoided speaking her name. Painters were ordered to destroy likenesses. Her initials were scraped out of palace stone. Even the people who quietly believed she was innocent learned to keep that belief buried deep. There's a special kind of violence in that. Not the violence that ends a life. The violence that tries to end a life twice. Once in flesh, then again in memory. And yet even a king can't fully control what survives, because the one thing Henry could not erase was the future. He disowned Elizabeth, declared her illegitimate, tried to starve her of status and dignity before she was old enough to understand what had been taken from her. He treated her like a stain he wanted to wash out of history. But history doesn't always follow the script of the powerful. Elizabeth grew. She learned the rules of survival in the same court that had murdered her mother. She learned silence when silence was necessary, and steel when steel was demanded. She watched the revolving door of Henry's wives, how quickly love turned to suspicion, how quickly suspicion became death. And she did what children of unstable power often do. She learned to read rooms like battlefields. When Henry died, the chaos he had set in motion didn't vanish. England lurched through reigns, through religious whiplash, through uncertainty. And then, against every intention Henry had ever formed, Elizabeth rose to the throne. The daughter he tried to erase became the monarch who defined an age. The Elizabethan era, England's flowering of power, culture, maritime reach, was built under the rule of the child Henry had treated as disposable. Anne's greatest legacy wasn't her death. It was that reign. A reign that proved the king's attempt at erasure had failed. Because you can destroy a body. You can smear a reputation. But you can't always stop the truth from resurfacing through time, through consequence, through people who outlive you. That's why Anne Boleyn still fascinates us half a millennium later. Not because she was the most innocent or the most guilty figure in Tudor drama, but because her story shows the terrifying reach of absolute power and its limits. Her death was not the conclusion of her life. It was an act of control meant to legitimize a king's desires and reshape reality itself. The horror isn't only in imagining her final seconds blindfolded on the scaffold. The horror is in watching how a government can manufacture guilt, weaponize rumor, and train a nation to applaud a lie. When you strip away the romance and the myths, what remains is a warning. A warning about propaganda, about unchecked authority, about how easily truth can be bent when one man holds the pen and the sword. And yet the final twist of Anne's story is that the erasure never fully held. Her name survived in whispers, then in histories, then in the legacy of the daughter who carried her blood into the crown. So when we return to those grim days in May 1536, we're not just revisiting a queen's execution. We're looking straight into the machinery of power, how it punishes, how it humiliates, how it rewrites, how it tries to make itself eternal. In the severed head of Anne Boleyn, we don't only find a tale of Tudor cruelty. we find something that echoes forward into every age. When power becomes absolute, truth is the first victim, and memory is the battlefield that follows.